Deliverance. How exactly did we get to the river in the first place, I asked. There's a little nothing town up here, just past the high ground, Lewis said, name of Ori. We can put in there and come out in Antry a couple of days later. If we get on the water late Friday, we can be back here the middle of Sunday afternoon, maybe in time for the last half of the pro game on TV. There's one thing that bothers me, Drew said. We don't really know what we're getting into. There's not one of us knows a damn thing about the woods or about rivers. The last boat I was in was my father-in-law's Chris craft up on Lake Bodie. I can't even row a boat straight, much less paddle my own or anybody else's canoe. What business have I got up there in those mountains? Listen, Lewis said, knocking on the air with his foreknuckle. You'll be in more danger on the 4-lane going home tonight than you'd ever be on the river. Somebody might jump the divider. Who knows? I mean, Bobby said, the whole thing does seem kind of crazy. All right, Lewis said, let me demonstrate. What are you going to be doing this afternoon? Well, Bobby thought a minute. Most likely I'll see a couple of new people about mutual funds. I have to draw up some papers and get them notarized. How about you, Drew? See some more route salesmen. We're making a cool account to figure out who's doing what and where we're falling short. We're trying to find ways to up the cold bottle sales, the same as always. Sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down. Right now they're down. Ed? Oh, I said take some photographs for Kit's textile mills. Kitten breeches. Cute girl in our breeches stroking her pussy. A real cat, you understand. Too bad, Lewis said and grinned, although talk about sex was never something he seemed to enjoy. He had made his point without saying anything about the afternoon. He looked around the suburban bar and brought his hand under his chin, waiting for the other two to decide. I thought that they probably wouldn't go. They were day-to-day happy enough. They were not bored in the way Lewis and I were bored, and Bobby particularly seemed to enjoy the life he was in. He came, I believe, from some other part of the South, maybe Louisiana, and since he had been around, since I had known him anyway, had seemed to do well. Drew Ballinger was a straightforward, quiet fellow. He was devoted to his family, particularly to his little boy. He worked as a sales supervisor for a big soft drink company, and he believed in it and the things it said it stood for with his very soul. He kept a copy of the company history on his living room coffee table at home, and the only time I ever saw him get mad was over a rival company's sales claims. Lewis and I were different, and were different from each other. I had nothing like his drive or his obsessions. Lewis wanted to be immortal. He had everything that life could give, and he couldn't make it work. And he couldn't bear to give it up or see age take it away from him either, because in the meantime he might be able to find what it was he wanted, the thing that must be there, and that must be subject to the will. He was the kind of man who tries by any means, weightlifting, diet, exercise, self-help manuals from taxidermy to modern art, to hold on to his body and mind and improve them, to rise above time. I glanced over at him. He had a face like a hawk, but it was a special kind of hawk. Instead of the front of his head seeming to be made from top to bottom, his looked like it had been palm molded into a long-nosed shape from the sides. He was clay-red and sandy-haired, with a whitish patch back up toward the crown of his head, where the other hair was darker. Well, well, he said, what about it? I was very glad I was going. I'll go, Drew said, if I can bring a marten along. Sure, bring it, Lewis said. It would be kind of good to hear, way off up in there. Without having any talent, as he would be the first to tell you, Drew played mighty well through sheer devotion. He had been at it with guitar and banjo, mostly guitar, for 12 years and went in for all the really hard finger-picking stuff. Okay, fellow primitives, Bobby said, but I insist on some creature comforts, namely liquor. Bring all you like, Lewis said. In fact, the sensation of going down white water about half drunk is not to be missed. You taking your bow, Lewis? I asked. You know it, he said, and if one of us stabs a deer, we can eat the meat and pack the hide and the head out, and I'll cure the hide and mount the head. Atomic survival stuff, eh? Bobby said. The best kind. It sounded fine to me, though I knew it would be poaching this early in the fall, but I also knew that Lewis would do what he said. These were some of the other things he had learned. Can you get your car, Drew? Lewis asked as we stood up to leave the bar together. Sure, he said. One of 'em's mine, and my boy's not old enough to drive it. Ed and I'll meet y'all early Friday, around 6:30, where Wills Ferry Road runs into the 4-lane, at the big new Wills Plaza shopping center. I'll call Sam Steinhauser this evening and see what shape his canoe's in. Most of the other stuff I've got. Wear tennis shoes. Bring liquor and an open mind. We went. Here we go, he said, out of the sleep of mild people into the wild, rippling water. With the canoe beaked over the car roof, Lewis and I slid down the driveway, turned left and picked up speed, then turned left again and cruised. I propped up a foot and waited for the last of the downhill, and when we leveled out, we were at the shopping center. Drew's Oldsmobile was parked about 50 yards this side of the 4-lane. An old wooden canoe, something that looked like it belonged on a lake instead of a river, was webbed onto the top of the car with a lot of frayed rope. It had an army blanket under it to keep it from scratching the car. Lewis gunned past the Olds and up the ramp onto the freeway. As we went past, I gave the others the Churchill V sign, and Bobby replied with the classic single finger. I faced ahead and stretched out on the seat. The highway shrank to 2 lanes, and we were in the country. The change was not gradual. You could have stopped the car and got out at the exact point where suburbia ended and the redneck South began. I would have liked to have done that, to see what the sense of it would be. There was a motel, then a weed field, and then on both sides Clabber Girl came out of hiding, leaping onto the sides of barns. 666 and Black Draft began to swirl, and Jesus began to save. We hummed along, borne with the inverted canoe on a long tide of patent medicines and religious billboards. From such a trip, you would think that the South did nothing but dose itself and sing gospel songs. You would think that the bowels of the Southerner were forever clamped shut, that he could not open and let natural process flow through him, but needed one purgative after another in order to make it to church. We stopped in a little town named Saluka and had breakfast at a restaurant called the Busy Bee. It was great, I thought. A big meal with grits and eggs and lots of butter and biscuits and preserves. Then we were back on the road again. Up ahead, the road ran between 2 hills. Lined up dead center between them was a mountain, high, broad, and blue, the color of concentrated wood smoke. There were others farther back from it, falling back, receding left and right. Funny thing, Lewis said. I leaned around. Funny thing about up yonder, he said, the whole thing's different. I mean, the whole way of taking life and the terms you take it on. What should I know about that, I said. The trouble is, he said, that you not only don't know anything about it, you don't want to know anything about it. Why should I? Because for the Lord's sake there may be something important in the hills. Do you know what? No, I don't know anything. I don't mind going down a few rapids with you and drinking a little whiskey by a campfire, but I don't give a fiddler's fuck about those hills. But do you know, he said, and his quietness made me listen, although with the reservation that it had better be good if he put that much emphasis on it. There are songs in those hills that collectors have never put on tape, and I've seen one family with a dulcimer. So what does that prove? Maybe nothing, maybe a lot. I'll leave that to Drew, I said, but do you know something, Lewis? If those people in the hills, The ones with the folk songs and dulcimers came out of the hills and led us all toward a new heaven and a new earth. It would not make a particle of difference to me. I am a get-through-the-day man. I don't think I was ever anything else. I am not a great art director. I am not a great archer. I am mainly interested in sliding. Do you know what sliding is? No. You want me to guess? I'll tell you. Sliding is living anti-friction. Or no, sliding is living by anti-friction. It is finding a modest thing you can do and then greasing that thing. On both sides, it is grooving with comfort. You don't believe in madness, eh? I don't at all. I know better than to fool with it. So what you do is to go on by it. What you do is to get done what you ought to be doing. And what you do rarely, and I mean rarely, is to flirt with it. We'll see, Lewis said, glancing at me as though he had me. We'll see. I just believe the whole thing is going to be reduced to the human body, once and for all. I want to be ready. What whole thing? The human race thing. I think the machines are going to fail. The political systems are going to fail. And a few men are going to take to the hills and start over. I looked at him. He lived in the suburbs like the rest of us. He had money, a good-looking wife, and 3 children. I could not really believe that he came in from placating his tenants every evening and gave himself solemnly to the business of survival insofar as it involved his body. What kind of fantasy led to this? I asked myself. Did he have long dreams of atomic holocaust in which he had to raise himself and his family out of the debris of less strong folk and head toward the same blue hills we were approaching? I said, if you wanted to, you could go up in the hills and live right now. You could have all those same conditions. You could hunt. You could farm. You could suffer just as much now as if they dropped the H-bomb. You could even start a colony. How do you think Carolyn would like that life? It's not the same, Lewis said. Don't you see? It would just be eccentric. Survival depends on having to survive. The kind of life I'm talking about depends on its being the last chance, the very last of all. I hope you don't get it, I said. It's too big a price to pay. No price is too big, Lewis said, and I knew that part of the conversation was over. What's the life like up there now? I asked. I mean, before you take to the mountains and set up the kingdom of sensibility. Probably not too much different from what it's liable to be then, he said. Some hunting and a lot of screwing and a little farming, some whiskey making. There's lots of music. It's practically coming out of the trees. Everybody plays something, the guitar, the banjo, the auto harp, the spoons, the dulcimer, or the dulcimore, as they call it. I'll be disappointed if Drew doesn't get to hear some of that stuff while we're up here. These are good people, Ed, but they're awfully clannish. They're set in their ways. They'll do what they want to do no matter what. Every family I've ever met up here has at least one relative in the penitentiary. Some of them are in for making liquor or running it, but most of them are in for murder. They don't think a whole lot about killing people up here. They really don't. But they'll generally leave you alone if you do the same thing. I looked off at the blue forms of the mountains, growing less transparent and cloud-like, shifting their positions, rolling from side to side off the road, coming back and centering in our path, and then sliding off the road again, but strengthening all the time. We went through some brush and then out across a huge flat field that ran before us for miles, going straight at the bulging range of hills, which was now turning mile by mile from blue to a light green gold, the color of billions of hardwood leaves. Around noon we started up among them, still on the highway. At an intersection we turned off onto a blacktop state road, and then from that onto a badly cracked and weedy concrete highway of the old days, the 30s as nearly as I could tell, with the old splattered tar center line wavering onward. From that we turned onto another concrete road that sagged and slewed and holed out and bumped ahead, not worth maintaining at all. It was still about 40 miles to Horry. We had to get there, hire 2 men to drive the cars back to Aintree, and then go downriver and find a campsite and set up camp. If possible, we also wanted to buy some more supplies. We had time, but we didn't have any to waste. Lewis speeded up. A bad road always challenged him. The canoe bumped and grated overhead. It was a warm day. Everything was green, and through the green there was that subtle gold-coming color that makes the green hurt to look at. Finally we came to Horry. It was evidently the county seat, for it had a little whitewashed building it called the town hall. The jail was part of it, and an old-fashioned fire engine was parked at one side. We went to a Texaco station and asked if there was anybody there who'd like to make some money. When Lewis killed the engine, the air came alive and shook with insects, even in the center of town, an in-and-out responding silence of noise. An old man with a straw hat and work shirt appeared at Lewis's window, talking in. He looked like a hillbilly in some badly cast movie, a character actor too much in character to be believed. I wondered where the excitement was that intrigued Lewis so much. Everything in Horry was sleepy and hookwormy and ugly, and most of all inconsequential. Nobody worth a damn could ever come from such a place. It was nothing, like most places and people are nothing. Lewis asked the fellow if he and somebody else would drive our cars down to Aintree for $20. "Take 2 of you to drive this thing?" the man asked. "If that was the case, we'd need 4, Lewis said, and didn't explain. He just sat there and waited. I glanced up at the prow of the canoe, the hook coming at us from above. After a long minute, Drew and Bobby drove up beside us. "See what I mean?" Lewis said. The other 2 got out and came over. The old man turned as though he were being surrounded. His movements were very slow, like those of someone whose energies have been taken by some other thing than old age. It was humiliating to be around him, especially with Lewis's huge pumped-up bicep shoving out its veins in the sun where it lay casually on the window of the car. Out of the side of my eye, I saw the old man's spotted hands trembling like he was deliberately making them do it. There's always something wrong with people in the country, I thought. In the comparatively few times I had ever been in the rural South, I had been struck by the number of missing fingers. There had also been several people with some form of crippling or twisting illness, and some blind or one-eyed. No adequate medical treatment, maybe, but there was something else. You'd think that farming was a healthy life, with fresh air and fresh food and plenty of exercise, but I never saw a farmer who didn't have something wrong with him, and most of the time obviously wrong. I never saw one who was physically powerful either. Certainly there were none like Lewis. The work with the hands must be fantastically dangerous in all that fresh air and sunshine, I thought. The catching of an arm in a tractor part somewhere off in the middle of a field where nothing happened but that the sun blazed back more fiercely down the open mouth of one's screams. And so many snake bites deep in the woods as one stepped over a rotten log. so many domestic animals suddenly turning and crushing one against the splintering side of a barn stall. I wanted none of it, and I didn't want to be around where it happened either. But I was there, and there was no way for me to escape except by water from the country of nine-fingered people. Drew said, "Can you tell us something about the land around here? I mean, suppose we wanted to get down the river to Aintree. Could we do it?" "Well," the man said, "it's right rocky on down a piece. If there's been a rain, it raises way up, but it don't come over the banks leastways in most places. There ain't no danger of the valley flooding. Ain't nothing in it anyway. Furthest down I've been is Walker's Point, about 15 miles, where the land starts getting high. In a dry spell, the river drops on down out of sight. You got to lean way out over the rocks to see it. And they say there's another big gorge on down south, but I ain't never been there." "Do you think we can get down the river?" Drew asked. "In what?" "In these two canoes." "I wouldn't want to try it," he said, and then straightened up. "If it rains, you're liable to be in bad trouble. The water climbs them rock walls like a monkey." "What the hell," Lewis said. "It's not going to rain. Look up yonder." I looked up yonder. It was clear, hazy, hot blue with no clouds. It seemed all right if it stayed that way. "If it rains, we'll just find us a place and hole up," Lewis said. "I've done it before." "You'll have a time holding up if you get down in that gorge." "We'll make out." "All right," the old man said. "You asked me. I told you." Drew and Bubby turned to go back to the Olds, and the Texaco man walked back alongside of Drew. I heard him ask, "Whose guitar is that there, Ian?" Then he was jumping like a dog on his hind legs back into the filling station. "Lonnie," he hollered, "come on out here." He came back, and behind him was an albino boy with pink eyes like a white rabbit's. One of them stared off at a furious and complicated angle. That was the eye he looked at us with his face set in another direction. The sane, rational eye was fixed on something that wasn't there, somewhere in the dust of the road. "Get your banjo," the old man said, and then to Drew, "Come on, play us a little something." Drew grinned, rolled down the back window of the wagon, got out the big cracked Martin, and put on his finger picks. He came back to the front of the Olds and hiked himself onto the hood with one leg up to hold the guitar. He tuned for a minute, and Lana came back holding up a 5-string banjo with a capo made out of rags and rubber bands. "Lana don't know nothing but banjo picking," the old man said. "He ain't never been to school. When he was little, he used to sit out in the yard and beat on a lard can with a stick." "What are we going to play, Lonnie?" Drew asked, his glasses opaque with pleasure. Lonnie stood holding the banjo, looking off from us now with both eyes, the eyes splitting apart and all of us in the blind spot. "Anything," the old man said. "Play anything." Drew started in on Wildwood Flower, picking it out at medium tempo and not putting in many runs. Lonnie dragged on the rubber bands and slipped the capo up. Drew started to come on with the volume. The Martin boomed out and over the dusty filling station. I had never heard him play so well, and I really began to listen deeply, moved as an unmusical person is moved when he sees that the music is meant. Drew and Lonnie put the instruments together and leaned close to each other in the pose you see vocal groups and phony folk singers take on TV programs, and something rare and unrepeatable took hold of the way I saw them, the demented country kid and the big-faced decent city man, the minor civic leader and hedge clipper. I was glad for Drew's sake we had come. Just this incident would be plenty to satisfy him. "God damn," he said as they finished. "Come on, Drew," Lewis said. "Put that thing away. We got to get water under us." "I could play with this guy all day," Drew said. "Can you wait just a minute? I'd like to get his name and address." He turned to Lonnie, then quickly to the old man. He was, I guess, afraid that Lonnie didn't know his name and address. They walked together a few steps, almost out of the area of the filling station, and stood talking. Then Drew passed the Martin to the old man and took a pencil and his wallet out of his pocket and wrote carefully what the old man told him. Once the old man touched Drew's shoulder, Drew came back, and the old man and Lonnie went inside. "You know," Drew said to all of us, "I'd like to come back up here just to hear some more music. I thought all the real country pickers had long since gone to Nashville." "How about the river?" Lewis asked. "He tells me you can't get down to the river anywhere in town here. It's too steep. But 8 or 10 miles north of here, the land's flat. We might be able to find us a road through the woods. There was a logging operation up there a few years back, and he thinks there are still some roads that go down to the river or somewhere around it." "How about drivers?" "He doesn't have anybody here, but there are a couple of brothers who run a garage out the way we're going to have to go, and they might be able to do it." We drove out of town. We were higher up than I thought. We went over a bridge, and through the whirling girders of the supports the river was flickering. It was green, peaceful, slow, and I thought very narrow. It didn't look deep or dangerous, just picturesque. It was hard to imagine that it flowed through woods anywhere, or that animals drank from it, or that it was going to be dammed up and become a lake. North of town, about half a mile, we stopped. Lewis thought it would be a good idea for Drew and Bobby to buy supplies while Lewis and I made the deal about the cars. We could see the Griner Brothers' garage from where we were, and Lewis told Drew to meet us there in half an hour. We drove up to the garage, parked, and knocked on the door. A man answered. He was a huge creature, 20 pounds heavier than Lewis, dressed in overall pants and an old-fashioned sleeveless undershirt, with a train engineer's cap on and cut-down army boots. There is no good way to start a conversation under conditions like that. All I wanted to do was disappear, so as not to have to explain what I was doing there. But Lewis walked up to the man and said, "I was wondering if you and somebody else, maybe a brother, would drive 2 cars down to Entry for us for $20. Or if you wanted to get a third fellow to drive another car, so you'd have a way to get back to Ori, we'd give all 3 of you $10 apiece." "Drive 'em down there for what?" "We want to take a canoe trip down the Cohulawasi, and we'd like for our cars to be in Entry when we get there day after tomorrow." "A canoe trip?" he said, looking back and forth between us. "That's right," Lewis said, narrowing his eyes a little. "A canoe trip." "You have been down in there?" "No," Lewis said. "Have you?" Griner set his heavy-hanging face on Lewis. They battled in midair. The sound of crickets in the grass around the garage clashed like shields and armor plate. I could see the man was insulted. Lewis himself had told me that the worst thing you can do is to throw something back at these mountain people. "No," Griner answered slowly. "I ain't never been down in there much. Ain't nothing to go down in there for. Fishing's no good." "How about hunting?" "Never been, but I don't believe I'd go down in there if I was you." "What's the use of it?" "Because it's there," Lewis said, for my benefit. "It's there all right," Griner said. "If you get down in there and can't get out, you're going to wish it wouldn't." My chest felt hollow, and my heart was ringing like iron. I wanted to back out, just to go back to town and forget it. I hated what we were doing. "Listen, Lewis," I said, "to hell with it. Let's go back and play golf." He didn't pay any attention. "Well, can you do it?" he asked Griner. "How much did you say?" $20 for 2 men, 30 for 3. 50, Griner said. 50 my ass, Lewis said. Good God, I thought, why is he like this? I was scared to death, and I resented insanely Lewis is getting me into such a situation. Well, you didn't have to come, I told myself, but never again. Never. How about 40? Bryna said. Lewis kicked the ground and turned to me. Are you good for 10? I took out the money and gave it to him. 20 now, Lewis said to Griner. We'll send the rest to you. If we're good for this, we're good for the rest. Take it or leave it. Good enough, Griner said, but it was hard not to believe he was saying something mean. He took the bills and looked at them and put them in his pocket. He went across the yard toward the house, and we went around front back to the car. What do you think? I asked Lou. You reckon we'll ever see these cars? This is a rough son of a bitch. Why wouldn't he and his brother just go off and sell them? Because we know who he is, Lewis said matter-of-factly, and he doesn't come by $20 so easy as all that. Sure, the cars will be right there when we get there. Don't worry about it. After a few minutes, Griner came out of the house with his even bigger brother alongside. They were like two pro football linemen in their first season after retirement, when they are beginning to soften up, working as night watchmen. We didn't try to introduce ourselves. The thought of asking them to shake hands with us never occurred to me until years later. I still wonder what would have happened if we had tried. Drew's car came into sight from behind us. We told them what the arrangements were. The brothers and another man, who just simply materialized, got into an old Ford pickup with the paint seared off in patches clear down to the naked metal, and followed us. It seemed to me that we should have been following them. But from the filling station, Lewis had the information he wanted. It was not much, but it was enough for him. He knew where the river was approximately. He knew that the land flattened to the north, and that they had been logging in the woods near the river. That all this might possibly be misinformation did not make the slightest difference to him. He was going there. The road kept dropping and failing. Finally, it was only the ghost of a road. It was hard to believe that there had ever been any vehicles on it. It was almost like the rest of the woods. We eased on down. Once we had to crawl over a washout with the wheels barely balanced on each side. It would have been tough going in a Jeep, even. All at once the road fell away and slid down a kind of bank. The river opened and was there. It was gray-green, very clear, and yet with a certain milkiness, too. It looked as though it would turn white and foam at rocks more easily than other water. It was about 40 yards wide and shallow, about 2.5 or 3 feet deep. The bed was full of clean brown pebbles. We couldn't see very far upstream or down because of our position and because of the willows, but just watched the part in front of us going by and by, carrying nothing, not even a twig. There she is, Lewis said, still looking straight ahead. Pretty, I said. Pretty indeed. It took us a good long time to get the canoes off the cars and over the gully and the bank. Lou and Bobby pulled the canoes up the bank by the nose, hauling on the bow ropes, and Drew and I shoved from behind. Finally, we slid them out through the willows. We put the wooden canoe in first. Lewis got down in the water, up to his knees in the bank mud, and supervised the loading. Both canoes had floorboards, though they were held in only by gravity and by the seats. We put in the perishables first, and then the waterproof tents over everything, lashing them to the floorboard slats. Drew slid down into the water, and finally, so did I. Lewis and Bobby kept coming through the willows, carrying stuff, and Drew and I kept cramming it under the lashed-down tents any way we could. Finally, Bobby came through the leaves for the last time. "We're ready," he said. "Everything all set about the cars?" "Far as I can tell," he said, "and Lewis is dealing with those guys now. I'm sure glad we're getting rid of them." Far off, we heard a car start. It occurred to me that I had no idea at all of who the third driver in the truck was. I had not seen his face or not noticed it. We now had our life jackets on, and I held the wooden canoe steady for Bobby to get in. He swayed out over the river and got into the bow seat. Lewis followed. The weight sank the canoe far enough into the water to make it as stable as it would ever be. "Okay," Lewis said. "Turn loose." I did. They floated free. I stood watching over my shoulder. My feet were pointed toward the bank. I was mired down so far that I began to wonder how I was going to get out. I stayed rooted, holding on to the aluminum canoe while Drew got into the front and picked up the paddle. "This how you hold this thing?" he asked me. "I reckon," I said. "You hold it like you hold it." I got one foot out of the mud by driving the other one down about twice as far, and then grabbed a long branch and pulled myself up as best I could with the river holding on to me hard by the left leg. "It's got me," I said. "What's got you?" "It." I scrambled and pulled on the branch until I was out. I kicked a foothold into the bank and stepped wide from it into the stern of Lewis's canoe and was in, everything rocking and wallowing. We pushed out with the paddles from the bank. A slow force took hold of us. The bank began to go backward. I felt the complicated urgency of the current, like a thing made of many threads being pulled, and with this came the feeling I always had at the moment of losing consciousness at night, going toward something unknown that I could not avoid, but from which I would return. I dipped the paddle in. Movies and pictures of Indians on calendars gave me a general idea of what to do, and I waved the paddle slowly through the water, down and along the left side of the canoe. Drew dug in, and I swept with him. We settled into a good motion that moved us toward a curve. Once or twice my paddle hit the bottom rocks. This put an odd, dissonant, intimate feeling into my hands. We started into the curve just as the other canoe disappeared around it. I plowed a little harder to turn us exactly with the current. Drew glanced back, his glasses flashing, the life preserver not turning. His face side had a big grin. "Hey, hey," he said, "how about this?" The land on both sides climbed, and the river pulled us steadily toward a silver highway bridge. We went under, and the bridge clattered its boards as a pickup truck went over. The sky was beginning to smoke up with night, with complete, unlighted night. I concentrated, and the sound of water both deepened and went up a tone. There was another bend ahead, and the river seemed to strain to get there, and we with it. Around the turn it came into view and broadened in white. Everywhere we were going was filled with spring bubblings, with lively rufflings, not dangerous looking, but sprightly and vivid. There was not the sensation of the water's raging, but rather that of its alertness and resourcefulness, as it split apart at rocks, frothed lightly, corkscrewed, fluted, fell, recovered, jostled into helmet shapes over smooth stones, and then ran out of sight down long garden staircase steps around another turn. I looked for a way through. Drew pointed straight ahead, and it was better done that way than saying it. I sank the paddle into the river. I felt marvelous. We were about even with the other canoe. Like that, we went down more drifting than paddling, into the dark coming upriver to meet us. There were no rapids, though we kept hearing them, and we were riding through rocky banks and tall, mournful, long-leaf pines. A hawk circled in the dying blue, the trailing edge of his wings standing out sharply in the deep intensification of the evening sky. It was beginning to be very wild and quiet. I remembered to be frightened, and right away I was. It was the beautiful impersonality of the place that struck me the hardest. I would not have believed that it could hit me all at once like this, or with such force. The silence and the silent sound of the river had nothing to do with any of us. "Don't you think we ought to make camp pretty soon?" I said to Lewis. "Yeah, I do. I'm afraid if we go any further, the banks might begin to get too high for us to get out on. You all look for a place on the left, and we'll look over here." We ran some small rapids, phosphorescent in the twilight, feeling hardly more than a slight alteration of the stream under us. But it was enough to remind us of the trouble that would result if we were to dump the equipment in the water in the dark. The trees and bushes where I was looking were connecting, becoming one solid thing. It was very hard to make out what the details were like. But there did seem to be a kind of shelf about 4 feet up from the water. I pointed this out to Lewis, and he nodded. I swung the canoe toward the place, working cat-cornered against the bias of the stream. We hit the bank with a soft, yielding bump. I got squeamishly out into the water and held the canoe, the sliding cold around me full of the presence of night creatures. Drew scrambled out and tied us to a sapling. I pulled myself up and out as Bobby and Lewis maneuvered alongside. The hair on my shoulders crawled with discomfort. We unlashed the stuff and began to make camp. Lewis had brought some long flashlights, and he set these up on stumps and in the forks of bushes to form an area of concentrated light. In and out of this we moved, working at strange duties. Lewis pitched the tents, and Bobby and Drew made a show of looking around for firewood. When we had the tents up and the air sacks and sleeping bags inside them with a flashlight in each tent and the snake guards up, I felt a good deal better. We had colonized the place. Bobby poured everybody a stiff drink of bourbon, and we drank while Lewis made a fire against a bank of stones he had pulled up out of the ground or gathered from around the tents. He had brought stakes. He built up a big blaze, let it die down some, and then put the meat on in a buttered pan. The smell of the meat smoke was wonderful. We all had another drink and sat on the bank, watching the firelight uncertain and persistent on the water. We all sat without saying anything, and I was proud of us for that, and especially proud of Lewis, who I was afraid was going to expound. I stretched out on my back, paralleling the river. Drew tuned softly, then raked out a soft chord that flowed and floated away. "I've always wanted to do this," he said, "only I didn't know it." He moved up the neck, drawing out chord after chord. These built and shimmered on each other in the darkness in lonely harmony. Then he began to pick individual notes and put the bass under them. "It's Wood's music," he said. "Don't you think so?" "Sure do." Lewis brought over the cooked steaks while Drew played, and then we ate 2 little steaks apiece and big wedges of cake that Lewis's wife had made. We all had another drink. The fire was leaving us. In the river, it had already died. "You know," Lewis said, "we don't have too many more years for this kind of thing." "I guess not," I said. "But I can tell you I'm glad we came. I'm glad to be here. I wouldn't be anywhere else the way I feel." "It's true, Lewis," Bobby said. "It's all true what you said. It's great. And I think we did real good on the river. I mean, for amateurs." "Yeah, good enough, I reckon," Lewis said. "Well, to the sleeping bags, men," I said, stretching. "Had my first wet dream in a sleeping bag," Lewis said. "I surely did." "How was it?" Bobby asked. "Great. There's no repeating it." I stood up finally and creaked and stooped into the tent. I was massively tired and hated the laces of my tennis shoes, which had hardened in the water until I couldn't untie them. I pulled the shoes off by main strength, shucked off everything else as well, and got into the bag and zipped it up. Drew was still playing out on the bank. I could hear him trying out some high minor far away. I lay back in the soft down, crinkling into the elastic resistance of the air mattress. I snapped out the flashlight and closed my eyes. I could hear the river running at my feet, and behind my head the woods were unimaginably dense and dark. There was nothing in them that knew me. There were creatures with one forepaw lifted, not wanting yet to put the other down on a dry leaf for fear of the sound. There were the eyes made for seeing in this blackness. I opened my eyes and saw the dark in all its original color. Next morning we had pancakes with butter and sorghum. After we finished, Lewis went over to the stream to wash out the cooking stuff. We rolled the tents, wet and covered with leaves and pieces of bark, and lashed them into the canoes. I asked the others if they thought we might team up differently this time, for I was afraid that Lewis in his impatience might say something unpleasant to Bobby. And since Bobby suddenly seemed to me on the edge of exasperation with himself for coming, I thought it would probably be best if I took him on. Drew would not have laughed, or laughed in the right way, at the cracks that were Bobby's only means of salvaging his civility, and I figured I would. "How about it, Tiger?" I said to Bobby. "Okay," he said. "How far can we get today, do you reckon?" "Beats me," I said. "We'll get as far as we can. Depends on the water and how many places we have to walk through. Everybody, including the map, says there's a gorge down below here, and that sort of bothers me, but there's nothing we can do about it now." Bobby and I got in and shoved off, and right away I could tell I was in for a hard time. I was not in awfully good shape myself. When Bobby was wheezing and panting after the first 100 yards, he had no coordination at all, and changed the canoe from what it had been, with Drew's steady, serious weight in front, to a nervous, unstable craft that seemed bound and determined to do everything wrong, to get rid of us. I was sure that Lewis was disgusted with Bobby, and just as sure that I would be also before much longer. "Easy," I said, "easy. You're trying too hard. All we want to do is to hold this thing straight. We don't need to be pulling our guts out to get there. Just let the river do it. Let George do it." "George ain't doing it fast enough. I want to get the hell and gone out of this goddamn place." "Ah, no, it's not all that bad." "It's not. Mosquitoes ate me up last night. My bites have got bites. I'm catching a fucking cold from sleeping on the fucking ground. I'm hungry as hell for something that tastes good, and I don't mean sorghum. Just steady down a little, and we'll get there when we get there. It's not going to do your cold any good to dump in this river, you can bloody well bet." "Fuck it," he said. "Let's get on with it. I'm tired of this woods scene. I'm tired of shitting in a hole in the ground. This is for the Indians." After a while he settled down a little, and the back of his neck lightened its red. We dug a couple of strokes for every 25 yards, and the river moved us along. But I thought that the chances were pretty good with my high center of gravity and his nerves that we would spill before the day was out, especially if there were any fast stretches with lots of rocks. With the equipment and with Bobby and me, who were at least 50 pounds heavier than the other two, we were riding far too low in the water. We had too much stuff with us for the way we were teamed, and I signaled back to Lewis to pull over to the bank. He did, and we wallowed alongside the other canoe and tied up. "Can you take on some of the stuff in our canoe, Lewis?" I asked. "We're awful low and logy." "Sure. Go get the cooking equipment and the bedrolls. That ought to equalize us just about. You can also let us have about half the beer that's left." "Happy to. Everybody's going to need something to cool off with today." "Why do it just with beer?" Lewis said, unbuttoning his shirt. "It's shallow and slow here. I'm going to get wet." I transferred the bedrolls and beer and the primus and other cooking equipment to the other canoe. Lewis was already in the water naked, booming overhand down the current with a lot of back showing, like Johnny Weissmuller in the old Tarzan movies. He swam as well as he did everything else and outran the current easily. Then he came back, his eyes glaring with effort at water level. I shucked off my coveralls and dived in, and so did Drew. The river was very cold. It felt as though it had snow and ice in it, and had only just turned then to water. Drew said, "Gosh, that feels good." "It really does. I never felt anything more wonderful in my life." refreshing. You know, that's just what it is. I feel like I could go all day now. You better come on in for a minute, Bobby. No thanks. Whenever you're ready, me and the other fatso will just fatso on down, the washed and the unwashed. He sat with his knees drawn up, self-protective in the sun against the water chill he could see on us. Bobby and I went over to our canoe and tried to figure out what else we might be able to transfer to the other one. We finally ended up taking only one tent, my bow, a six-pack of beer, and Drew's guitar, for the wooden canoe was leaking a little, and ours was more or less dry. We wrapped the guitar in the tent, got in, and pushed off. We rowed a lot better now, and Bobby's paddling improved a good deal because of this, and maybe because he had convinced himself that the less trouble he was, the quicker we'd get off the river. The water was calm for a long time. We made turn after turn, sometime near one bank and sometime near the other. In the silence, the river seemed to go deeper and deeper under us. The colors changed toward denser greens as the sun got higher. The pace of the water began to pick up. We slid farther and farther with each stroke. I thought to myself that anyone fighting the brush along the bank could not keep up with us. Every now and then I glanced down at the bow at my feet, big-handled and tense-looking, and at its 2 arrows slathered with house paint. The big orange feathers spiraled out of them, and the emery-wheeled edges of the broadhead shone in the sun like radium. Though I would have had to do a good deal of curious balancing to string the bow, I kept looking on both sides of the river for deer, hoping that we might float in on a big buck drinking. It was something to do. We went on, taking long, slow swings at the water. After a few more hours, we had drunk all the beer we had. The sun was eating my bald spot, and my nylon outfit was soaking with me. My tongue began to balloon in my mouth, and my backbone was splintering through the skin. I looked back. The other canoe was just coming around. Lewis had lagged behind us because, I suppose, he wanted us in sight in case we got into trouble. Anyway, they were about a half a mile back and disappeared as we rounded another curve, and I pointed with my paddle to the left bank. I didn't know whether they saw me or not, but I figured to flag them in when they came by. I wanted to lie up in the shade and rest for a while. I was hungry, and I sure would have liked to have had another beer. We dug in and swung over to the bank. Bobby got out and moored us. "This is too much like work," he said, as he gave me a hand up. He sat down on the ground and untied a handkerchief from around his neck. He leaned down to the river and sopped it, then swabbed his face and neck down, rubbing a long time in the nose area. I bent over and touched my toes a couple of times to get rid of the position that had been maiming my back, and then looked upstream. I still couldn't see the other canoe. I turned to say something to Bobby. 2 men stepped out of the woods, one of them trailing a shotgun by the barrel. Bobby had no notion they were there until he looked at me. Then he turned his head until he could see over his shoulder and got up, brushing at himself. "How goes it?" he said. One of them, the taller one, narrowed in the eyes and face. They came forward, moving in a kind of half-circle as though they were stepping around something. The shorter one was older, with big white eyes and a half-white stubble that grew in whorls on his cheeks. His face seemed to spin in many directions. He had on overalls, and his stomach looked like it was falling through them. The other was lean and tall, and peered as though out of a cave or some dim, simple place far back in his yellow-tinged eyeballs. When he moved his jaws, the lower bone came up too far for him to have teeth. Escaped convicts flashed up in my mind on one side, bootleggers on the other, but they still could have been hunting. They came on and were ridiculously close for some reason. I tried not to give ground. Some principle may have been involved. The older one, looking and spinning his sick-looking face in front of me, said, "What the hell you think you doing?" "Going down the river. Been going since yesterday." I hoped that the fact that we were at least talking to each other would do some good of some kind. He looked at the tall man. Either something or nothing was passing between them. I could not feel Bobby anywhere near, and the other canoe was not in sight. I shrank to my own true size, a physical movement known only to me, and with the strain, my solar plexus failed. I said, "We started from Ori yesterday afternoon, and we hope we can get to Antry sometime late today or early tomorrow." "Antry?" Bobby said, and I could have killed him. "Sure. This river just runs one way, Captain. Haven't you heard?" "You ain't never gonna get down to Antry," he said, without any emphasis on any word. "Why not?" I asked, scared but also curious. In a strange way, it was interesting to cause him to explain. "Because this river don't go to Antry," he said. "You done taken a wrong turn somewhere. This here river don't go nowhere near Antry." "Where does it go?" It goes to Circle Gap," the other man said, missing his teeth and not caring. "About 50 miles. "Boy," said the whorl-faced man, "you don't know where you are." "Well," I said, "we're going where the river's going. We'll come out somewhere, I reckon." The other man moved closer to Bobby. "Hell," I said, "we don't have anything to do with you. We sure don't want any trouble. You're right. We don't know where we are." I looked at the river, but we were a little back from the bank, and I couldn't see the other canoe. I didn't think it could have gone past, but I was really not sure that it hadn't. With the greatest effort in the world, I came back into the man's face and tried to cope with it. He had noticed something about the way I had looked at the river. "Anybody else with you?" he asked me. I swallowed and thought, with possibilities shooting through each other. If I said yes, and they meant trouble, we would bring Lewis and Drew into it, with no defenses. Or it might mean that we would be left alone, 4 being too many to handle. On the other hand, if I said no, then Lewis and Drew, especially Lewis, might be able to do something. "No," I said, and took a couple of steps inland to draw them away from the river. The lean man reached over and touched Bobby's arm, feeling it with strange delicacy. Bobby jerked back, and when he did, the gun barrel came up almost casually, but decisively. "We'd better get on with it," I said. "We got a long ways to go." I took part of a step toward the canoe. "You ain't going nowhere," the man in front of me said, and leveled the shotgun straight into my chest. My heart quailed away from the blast, tamped into both barrels, and I wondered what the barrel openings would look like at the exact instant they went off. "You come on back in here unless you want your guts all over this here woods." I half raised my hands like a character in a movie. Bobby looked at me, but I was helpless, my bladder quavering. I stepped forward into the woods through some big bushes that I saw but didn't feel. They were all behind me. The voice of one of them said, "Back up that sapling." I backed up to the tree he had selected. The lean man came up to me and took off my web belt with a knife and rope on it. Moving his hands very quickly, he unfastened the rope and let the belt out and put it around me in the tree so tight I could hardly breathe. with the buckle on the other side of the tree. He came back holding the knife. It occurred to me that they must have done this before. It was not a technique they would just have thought of for the occasion. The lean man held up the knife, and I looked for the sun to strike it, but there was no sun where we were. "Look at that," the tall man says to the other. "I bet that'll shave hair. Won't you try it? Looks like that one's got plenty of it, except on his head." The tall man put the flat of the knife against my chest and scraped it across. He held it up, covered with black hair and a little blood. "It's sharp," he said. "Could be sharper, but it's sharp." The blood was running down from under my jaw where the point had been. I had never felt such brutality and carelessness of touch, or such disregard for another person's body. It was not the steel or the edge of the steel that was frightening. The man's fingernail, used in any gesture of his, would have been just as brutal. The knife only magnified his unconcern. I looked straight up into the branches of the sapling I was tied to, and then down into the clearing at Bobby. They both went toward Bobby, the lean man with the gun this time. The white-bearded one took him by the shoulders and turned him around toward downstream. "Now less you just drop them pants," he said. Bobby lowered his hands hesitantly. "Drop?" he began. My rectum and intestines contracted. Lord God. The toothless man put the barrels of the shotgun under Bobby's right ear and shoved a little. "Just take 'em right on off," he said. "I mean, what's this all—" Bobby started again weakly. "Don't say nothing," the older man said. "Just do it." The man with the gun gave Bobby's head a vicious shove, so quick that I thought the gun had gone off. Bobby unbuckled his belt and unbuttoned his pants. He took them off, looking around ridiculously for a place to put them. "Them panties, too," the man with the belly said. Bobby took off his shorts like a boy undressing for the first time in a gym, and stood there plump and pink, his hairless thighs shaking, his legs close together. "Sit, log. Walk over yonder." Wincing from the feet, Bobby went slowly over to a big fallen tree and stood near it with his head bowed. "Now get on down crossed it." The tall man followed Bobby's head down with a gun as Bobby knelt over the log. "Pull your shirt tail up, fat ass." The white-bearded man was suddenly also naked up to the waist. There was no need to justify or rationalize anything. They were going to do what they wanted to. I struggled for life in the air, and Bobby's body was still and pink in an obscene posture that no one could help. The tall man restored the gun to Bobby's head, and the other one knelt behind him. A scream hit me, and I would have thought it was mine, except for the lack of breath. It was a sound of pain and outrage, and was followed by one of simple and wordless pain. Again it came out of him, higher and more carrying. I let all the breath out of myself and brought my head down to look at the river. "Where are they?" Every vein stood out to ask, and as I looked, the bushes broke a little in a place I would not have thought of, and made a kind of complicated alleyway out onto the stream. I was not sure for a moment whether it was water or leaves, and Lewis's canoe was in it. He and Drew both had their paddles out of water, and then they turned and disappeared. The white-haired man worked steadily on Bobby, every now and then getting a better grip on the ground with his knees. At last he raised his face as though to howl with all his strength into the leaves and the sky, and quivered silently, while the man with the gun looked on with an odd mixture of approval and sympathy. The whorl-faced man drew back, drew out. The standing man backed up a step and took the gun from behind Bobby's ear. Bobby let go of the log and fell to his side, both arms over his face. We all sighed. I could get better breath, but only a little. The two of them turned to me. I drew up as straight as I could and waited with the tree. It was up to them. I could sense my knife sticking in the bark next to my head, and I could see the blood vessels in the eyes of the tall man. That was all. I was blank. The bearded man came to me and disappeared around me. The tree jerked, and air came into my lungs in great gratitude. I fell forward and caught up short, for the tall man had put the gun up under my nose. "You're kind of bald-headed and fat, ain't you?" The tall man said. "What do you want me to say?" I said. "Yeah, I'm bald-headed and fat. That okay?" "Ain't no hair in his mouth," the other one said. "That's the truth." The tall one said, "Hold this on him." Then he turned to me, handing the gun off without looking. It stood in the middle of the air at the end of his extended arm. He said to me, "Fall down on your knees and pray, boy. And you better pray good." I knelt down. As my knees hit, I heard a sound, a snap-slap in the woods, a sound like a rubber band popping or a sickle blade cutting quick. The older man was standing with the gun barrel in his hand, and no change in the stupid, advantage-taking expression of his face, and 1.5 foot of bright red arrow was shoved forward from the middle of his chest. It was there so suddenly it seemed to have come from within him. None of us understood. We just hung where we were, the tall man in front of me unbuttoning his pants, me on my knees with my eyelids clouding the forest, and Bobby rolling back and forth off in the leaves in the corner of my eye. The gun fell, and I made a slow-motion grab for it as the tall man sprang like an animal in the same direction. I had it by the stock with both hands, and if I could pull it into me, I would have blown him in half in the next second. But he only gripped the barrel lightly and must have felt that I had it better, and felt also what every part of me was concentrated on doing. He jumped aside and was gone into the woods opposite where the arrow must have come from. I got up with the gun and swung the barrel back and forth to cover everything, the woods and the world. There was nothing in the clearing but Bobby and the shot man and me. The shot man was still standing. I couldn't believe him. He touched the arrow experimentally, and I could tell it was set in him as solidly as his breastbone. It was in him tight and unwobbling, coming out front and back. He took hold of it with both hands, but compared to the arrow's strength, his hands were weak. They weakened more as I looked and began to melt. He was on his knees and then fell to his side, pulling his legs up. He got up on one knee and then to his feet again while I stood with the shotgun at port arms. I was ready to pull, but there was no need. He crouched and fell forward with his face on my white tennis shoe tops, trembled away into his legs, and shook down to stillness. He opened his mouth, and it was full of blood. Nothing happened for 10 minutes. I wondered if maybe the other man wouldn't come back before Lewis showed himself. Then part of the bark of a big water oak moved at leg level, and Lewis moved with it, out into the open, stepping sideways into the clearing with another bright-crested arrow on the string of his bow. Drew followed him, holding a canoe paddle like a baseball bat. Lewis walked out between me and Bobby, over the man on the ground, and put his bow tip on a leaf. Drew moved to Bobby. I had been holding the gun ready for so long that it felt strange to lower the barrels so that they were pointing down and could kill nothing but the ground. I did, though, and Lewis and I faced each other across the dead man. His eyes were vivid and alive. He was smiling easily and with great friendliness. Well now, how about this? Just, how about this? I said, how did you figure it? We heard Bobby, and the only thing we could think of was that one of you had been bit by a snake. We started to come right in, but all at once it hit me that if it was something like snake bite, the other one of you could take care of the one that was bit just as well as three of us could, at least for a little while. And if there were some other people involved, I told Drew I had just as soon come in on them without them knowing it. And now what are we going to do with them? I asked. Drew moved up to us, washing his hands with dirt and beating them against the sides of his legs. There's not but one thing to do, he said. Put the body in one of the canoes and take it on down to Antry and turn it over to the highway patrol. Tell them the whole story. Tell them what, exactly? Lewis asked. Just what happened, Drew said, his voice rising in tone. This is justifiable homicide if anything is. They were sexually assaulting two members of our party at gunpoint. Like you said, there was nothing else we could do. Nothing else but shoot him in the back with an arrow? Lewis asked pleasantly. It was your doing, Lewis, Drew said. What would you have done? Wait a minute, I broke in. What we should or shouldn't have done is beside the point. He's there and we're here. We didn't start any of this. We didn't ask for it. But what happens now? Lewis sighed and scratched his head. We just ought to wait a minute before we decide to be so all-fired Boy Scoutish and do the right thing. There's not any right thing. You bet there is, Drew said. There's only one thing. I tried to think ahead, but I couldn't see anything but desperate trouble, and for the rest of my life. Lewis said, we ought to do some hard decision-making before we let ourselves in for standing trial up in these hills. We don't know who this man is, but we know that he lived up here. Everybody up here is kin to everybody else in one way or another. I'm goddamn if I want to come back up here for shooting this guy in the back, with a jury made up of his cousins and brothers, maybe his mother and father too, for all I know. He had a point. I listened to the woods and the river to see if I could get an answer. I saw myself and the others rotting for weeks in some country jail with country drunks. What do you think, Bobby? Lewis asked, and there was a tone in his voice which suggested that Bobby's decision would be final. Bobby was sitting on the same log he had been forced to lean over, one hand propping up his chin and the other over his eyes. He got up, 20 years older, and walked over to the dead man. Then, in an explosion so sudden that it was like something bursting through from another world, he kicked the body in the face. And again. Lewis pulled him back, his hands on Bobby's shoulders. Then he let him go, and Bobby turned his back and walked away. We've got to get rid of him, Lewis said. How? I asked. Where? Lewis turned his head to the river, then half lifted his hand and moved it in a wide gesture inland, taking in the woods in a sweep obviously meant to include miles of them, hundreds of acres. Another expression, a new color, came into his eyes, a humorous conspiratorial craftiness, his look of calculated pleasure, his enthusiast's look. He dropped the hand and rested it easily on the bow, having given Drew and me the woods, the whole wilderness. Everywhere, he said. Anywhere. Nowhere. Drew asked, and how do you know that that other guy's not around right now? It just might be that he's watching everything we do. Still looking off at the river, Lewis said, let's figure. We all stood, all facing Lewis over the corpse. Lewis crouched down over the dead man. If we take him on the river in the canoe, we'll be out in the open. If somebody was watching, he could see where we dropped him in. Besides, like Drew says, the river's the first place anybody'd look. So, we take him inland and upstream. We carry him to that little creek and up it until we find a good place, and then we bury him and the gun. Then Drew and I bent to the shoulders and lifted, and Bobby and Lewis took a foot apiece, with their free hands carrying the gun and the bow and an entrenching tool from the loaded canoe. The corpse sagged between us, extremely heavy, and the full meaning of the words "dead weight" dragged at me as I tried to straighten. So we buried him. It was unbelievable. I had never done anything like it, even in my mind. To say that it was like a game would not describe exactly how it felt. I knew it was not a game, and yet, whenever possible, had glanced at the corpse to see if it would come out of the phony trance it was in and stand up and shake hands all around. It was a dark place, quiet and almost airless. "Ferns will be growing here in a few days," Lewis said. It was good to hear a voice, especially his. Nobody had ever come on him in a million years. I doubt if even we could find this place again. We started back to the canoes. Lewis said to me, "You and Drew take my boat. Bobby and I will take everything we can in the other one. We'll try to keep up with you, but it'll be better if you lead off so that we can see you if you get into trouble. I hate to tell you, but from what little I know, we haven't hit the rough part of this river yet." "Take everything, if you can take it, Lewis," I said. "If Drew and I have to go through these damn rapids first, I want a boat I can at least halfway handle. And I don't want things wrapping around me in the water." "I don't blame you," Lewis said. "We'll take all we can." "All I want is a weapon," I said. "I'll take my bow." We were ready. Drew crawled into the front of the aluminum canoe. I was glad he was there. I could work with him. He sat with the paddle just out of the river, shaking his head. Neither of us said anything until I told him to push off. It was about 4 o'clock, and the thought of spending another night in the woods paralyzed me. We moved well for the better part of an hour. Lewis was keeping up too, driving the almost buried canoe forward with an effort I could not even guess at. I was very glad that Drew and I were light and maneuverable. There were no rapids, but the river seemed to be moving faster. We pulled and pulled at the river. There was no white water, but the sound was changing, getting deeper and more massively frantic and authoritative. We couldn't make it to Antry by dark. I knew that now. And we couldn't survive on the river, even as it was here, without being able to see. The last place I wanted to be was on the river in the gorge, in the dark. It might be better to pull over while it was still light and find a flat rock or a sandbar to camp on or get ready to sleep in the canoes. We came around one more bend, and at the far end of it the riverbed began to step down. There was a succession of small, rough rapids. I couldn't tell how far they went on. The water was throwing us mercilessly. I tried to hold Drew centered on the white water, to line him up and shoot him through the rocks. "Give me some speed, baby," I hollered. Drew lifted his paddle and started to dig in long and hard. Something happened to him. It looked at first, I can see it in my mind, in 3 dimensions and slow motion and stop action, as if something, a puff of wind but much more definite and concentrated, snatched at some of the hair at the back of his head. For a second I thought he had just shaken his head, or had been jarred by the canoe in some way I hadn't felt. But at the same instant I saw this happen, I felt all control of the canoe go out of it. The river whirled the paddle from Drew's hand as though it had never been there. His right arm shot straight out, and he followed it, turning the whole canoe with him. There was nothing I could do. I rolled with the rest. In a reflex, just before my head smashed face first into the white water, with the whole river turning around in midair and beginning to swing upside down, I let go of the paddle and grabbed for the bow at my feet, for even in panic, I knew I would rather have a weapon than the paddle, as dangerous as it would be to have the naked broadheads near me in such water. The river took me in, and I had the bow. My life jacket brought me up, and Lewis's canoe was on top of me like a whale, rising up on the current. It hit me in the shoulder, driving me down where the rocks swirled like marbles, and something, probably a paddle, thrust into the side of my head as Lewis or Bobby fended me off like a rock. I kicked at the rushing stones and rose up. Downstream, the green canoe drove over the broadside other one, reared nearly straight up, and Bobby and Lewis pitched out on opposite sides. A rock hit me, and I felt some necessary thing, a muscle or bone, go in my leg. I kicked back with both feet and caught something solid. I must have been upside down, for there was no air. My head came out of the water, and I actually thought of putting it under again. But I got a glimpse of the two canoes, and that interested me enough to keep me alive. The wooden canoe burst open on a rock and disappeared, and the aluminum one leapt free and went on. I got on my back and poured with the river. With my life preserver, the upper part of my body drew almost no water. Finally, I started to struggle weakly around to look upstream for the others. My body was heavy and hard to move without the tremendous authority of the rapids to help it and tell it what to do. Either upstream or down, there was nobody in the river but me. As I thought that, Bobby tumbled out of the rapids, rolling over and over on the slick rocks, and then flopped belly down into the calm. I pointed to the bank, and he began feebly to work toward it. So did I. "Where is Lewis?" I yelled. He shook his head, and I stopped pulling on the water and turned to wait in midstream. After a minute or two, Lewis came, doubled up and broken-looking, one hand still holding his paddle and the other on his face, clasping something intolerable. I breaststroked to him and lay beside him in the cold, coiling water. "My leg's broke," he gasped. "It feels like it broke off." "Hold on to me," I said, and hauled on the cross-grain of the current, with Lewis's choking weight dragging at my throat. From where we were, the cliff looked something like a gigantic drive-in movie screen, waiting for an epic film to begin. On the bank, Bobby helped drag us out. "Drew was shot," Lewis said with no lips. "I saw it. He's dead." "I'm not sure," I said, "but I was afraid that's what it was. Something happened to him, but I don't know. I've got to try to get that goddamn canoe. We'll stay here." I waded in and swam slow motion to the canoe, listening for the rifle shot I would never hear if it killed me, that I had not heard when it killed Drew, if it did. I shoved the canoe to Bobby. He waited and drew it up onto the sand by the bow rope, and we beached it under the overhang. I moved onto land, not saying anything. Though my mouth was open, I closed it against the blackness and moved to Lewis, who was lying in the sand. I could tell by its outline that his thigh was broken. It was not a compound fracture. I couldn't feel any of the bone splinters I had been taught to look for in innumerable compulsory first aid courses, but there was a great, profound human swelling under my hand. It felt like a thing that was trying to open, to split, to let something out. "Hold on, Lou," I said. It was all dark. The river sound enveloped us as it never could have in light. "Where is Drew?" Bobby asked. "Lewis says he's dead," I said. "Probably he is. He may have been shot. If Lewis is right, and I think he is, that toothless bastard drew down on us while we were lining up to go through the rapids and before we were going too fast. He killed the first man in the first boat. Next would have been me. Then you. In other words, his lucky was spilled." "Right. Lucky. Very lucky." It was an odd word to use where we were. "What are we going to do?" Bobby said. "The question is, what is he going to do? We're caught in this gorge. He can't come down here, but the only way out of this place for us is down the river. We can't run out of here at night, and when we move in the morning, he'll be up there somewhere." Jesus Christ Almighty. Yes, I said, you might say that. What can we do? It's either him or us. We've killed a man, so is he. Whoever gets out depends on who kills who. It's just that simple. I think it's reasonable to suppose that he saw well enough to know that he hit Drew and that the canoes turned over. He might believe that the rest of us drowned, but I don't believe he'd want to take the chance that we did. Well, said Bobby, we haven't got a goddamn chance if you and Lewis are right. If he's up there and wants to kill us, he can kill us. Well, now, it hadn't happened yet. He thinks we can't get at him. If we can kill him. I looked up at the gorge side, but I couldn't tell much about it except that it was awfully high. But the lower part of it, at least, wasn't quite as steep as I had thought at first. Rather than being absolutely vertical, it was more of a very steep slant, and I believed I could get up it at least part of the way when the moon came up enough for me to see a little better. Come here, Bobby, and listen. All right, I'm listening. Keep Lewis as warm and comfortable as you can when it gets first light, and I mean just barely light. Light enough for you to see where you're going. Get Lewis into the canoe and move out. The whole business is going to have to be decided right there. I strung the bow and checked the 2 arrows I had left. One was fairly straight. The other was badly bent, and I straightened it as well as I could with my hands, but there was not much I could do in the dark. I paid out and recoiled the thin rope that had been at my waist the whole time. I ran the rope over and over my left thumb and elbow until I had a tight ring. I tied the ends and passed the belt that held the big knife through the coil. Don't go to sleep, I said to Bobby. Not likely, he said. Oh, God. Now listen, if you go at first light, you'll make a damn hard target from the top of the gorge. I'll do everything I can to see that he doesn't crack down on you. Ed, will you tell me one thing? Have you ever thought that there might be more than one? Yes, I've thought of it. I must say I have. What if there is? Then we're likely to die early tomorrow morning. I believe you. I went over to the canoe near where Lewis was lying, tirelessly grinding the back of his head into the sand. I crouched down beside him. Kill him, Lewis said with a river. I'll kill him if I can find him, I said. Well, he said, here we are at the heart of the Lewis Medlock country. Pure survival, I said. This is what it comes to, he said. I told you. Yes, you told me. I backed off and ran with a hard scramble at the bank and stretched up far enough to get an elbow over the top side of the first low overhang. Scraping my sides and legs, I got up on it and stood up. Bobby and Lewis were directly beneath me under a roof of stone, and might as well not have been there. I was standing in the most entire aloneness than I had ever been given. I turned around with many small foot movements and leaned close to the cliff, taking on its slant exactly. I put my cheek against it and raised both hands up into the darkness, letting the fingers curl independently over the rock. I rose slowly off the top of the overhang and began to feel upward again. The cliff was not as steep as I had thought, though from what I had been able to tell earlier before we spilled, it would probably get steeper toward the top. I pulled upward, kneeing and toeing into the cliff, kicking steps into the shaly rock wherever I could, trying to position both hands and one foot before moving to a new position. I became aware of the sound of my breath whistling and humming crazily into the stone. The cliff was steepening, and I was laboring back-breakingly for every inch. My arms were tiring, and my calves were not so much trembling as jumping. I knew now that not looking down or back, the famous advice to people climbing things, was going to enter into it. Panic was getting near me. Despite everything, I looked down. The river had spread flat and filled with moonlight. It took up the whole of space under me, bearing in the center of itself a long, coiling image of light, a chill, bending flame. I must have been 75 or 100 feet above it, hanging poised over some kind of inescapable glory, a bright pit. I turned back into the cliff and leaned my mouth against it, feeling all the way out through my nerves and muscles exactly how I had possession of the wall at 4 random points in a way that held the whole thing together. I thought of going back down, working along the bank and looking for an easier way up, and I let one foot down behind me into the void. There was nothing. I stood with the foot groping for a hold in the air, then pulled it back to the place on the cliff where it had been. It burrowed in like an animal, and I started up again. Next time I looked down, I was about 150 feet over the river, as nearly as I could tell, and I believed that if I could get that far, I could get the rest of the way, even though the cliff was steeper here than it was lower down. I turned back. I turned back to the wall and the cliff and into my situation, trying to imagine how high the cliff had seemed to be the last time I had seen it by daylight, and trying to estimate where I was on it. I thought I surely must be 3/4 of the way up. Above me the darks changed, and in one of them was a star. On both sides of that small light the rocks went on up, black and solid as ever, but their power was broken. The high, deadly part of the cliff I was on bent and rocked steadily over toward life and toward the hole with the star in it, where as I went more stars were added until a constellation like a crown began to form. I was now able to travel on knees, my knees, after all, the bow scraping the ground beside me. My feet slanted painfully in one direction or another, guided by what kind of guesswork I could not say. I kept scrambling and stumbling upward like a creature born on the cliff and coming home. Often a hand or foot would slide and then catch on something I knew without knowing would be there, and I would go on up. There was nothing it could do against me in the end. By some such way as this, I got into a little canyon. Yes, and I stood up. The bottom underfoot, was full of loose rocks and boulders, but I was walking it. I was out. I sat on a cold rock at the edge, looking down. I came back by degrees to the purpose. Our whole hope rested on our being able to second-guess the man, and now that I was on top of the gorge, it seemed to me that we had guessed right, or as right as it was possible for us to do. I had to ambush him in some way, if possible from behind, and this depended on my being able to locate the place he would pick to shoot from, and on luck. I had thought so long and hard about him that to this day I still believe I felt in the moonlight our minds fuse. Since I needed to be in a place where I could see the river, and as much of it as possible, in order to know whether or not the canoe was in sight of the man, I wanted to get as high as possible and out of sight, and that meant a rock with an overlook, or a tree. I remembered that when the bow hunting of deer from tree stands first hit our state, a lot of hunters who had never been near an animal in the woods bagged deer the first time they tried it. Deer are supposed to have no natural enemies in trees, and so seldom look up. This was not much to go on, but there were plenty of trees growing near the edge of the cliff. First, though, I would have to get down the river and find the right spot. I began to make my way over the boulders at the edge, paralleling the rapids, which went on and on as far as I could see, and discovered there was only one place that looked right for this. It was surrounded on the upstream side by jumbled rocks, but was easier to get to from inland, as far as I could tell. There was a pale sandy platform at the very edge that looked down on the river through a thicket of grass, about a yard high. As far as I was concerned, this was it. We were still far enough from houses and highways not to be heard, but I was fairly sure that we were not awfully far even so, and the closer we were, the less likely he would be to take a chance. If he doesn't come here, I thought, but picks another calm place downstream, Bobby and Lewis have had it. There was not much chance that I had really guessed right. It was just the best that I could do. There was still no light in the sky but moonlight. I turned away from the river where the land shelved back to some boulders and low trees and felt around. Among the trees which held the light from me, I could tell nothing except by touch. I put out a foot because I could reach further that way. Something solid was there. I took a step toward it and was enveloped at once in branches and the stiff pine hairs. I climbed into the lower limbs, which were very thick and close together, and went up until the tree swayed. I began to do what I could about setting up a blind in the tree. I cleared away the small needle twigs between myself and the platform of sand. It was not hard to do. I just kept taking things away from between the river light and my face until there were not any. When I was back against the bole of the tree, I was looking down a short, shaggy tunnel of needles. I would shoot right down that. It even seemed to help me aim. I got as comfortable as I could and decided to stay in the tree until late. I began to practice stillness, for that was what I was up there for. It was slow waiting. My head bent forward and seemed to want to keep on going down. I snapped awake 2 or 3 times, but slower each time, with less snap. Once I leapt up out of the oldest dream of all, the oldest and most dreamlike, the one about starting to fall. Then the needles were filling slowly with the beginnings of daylight. I opened my mouth so that my breathing would be more silent. The light strengthened. My sense of utter concealment began to die out of me and out of the tree. Something caught the tail of my left eye, and my stomach froze. I didn't turn my head at once, but slowly. I knew, though. I knew and knew. A rock clicked on another, and a man was walking forward onto the sand with a rifle. He had one hand in his right pocket. This is it, I thought. I squeezed the first and middle fingers around the arrow nock, took a slow, open-mouthed breath, and leaned back, tense and still. He was looking up the river and standing now with both hands on the gun. I tensed my arm to see if the muscles would work. The string took on a small angle. I looked right at him, and he gave a little more of himself to the hole in the needles. He seemed puzzled. He kept looking back from the river down at his feet, at the ground there, half sand and half rock, and every time his head inclined and his hidden face bent down, he looked at a place farther from the river and nearer to where I was. I closed my eyes, took a slow 3/4 breath, held it, and leveled the bow, inch by inch. We were close together, and the feeling of a peculiar kind of intimacy increased, for he was shut within a frame, all of my making, the peep sight and the alleyway of needles, and I knew then that I had him. If my right hand just relaxed and let the arrow tear itself away, and if my left arm did not move, but just took up the shock of the vibrating bow, everything was right. It could not have been better. Then he moved, slightly but quickly, and I fought to hold on to the arrow. He stirred the ground once with his foot, and I saw his face, saw that he had a face, for the first time. The whole careful structure of my shot began to come apart, and I struggled in my muscles and guts and heart to hold it together. His eyes were moving over the sand and rock, faster and faster. They were coming. When they began to rise from the ground, they triggered my release. I never saw the arrow in the air, and I don't believe he did either, though he surely must have heard the bow twang. What happened next I was not sure about, and still am not. The tree thrummed like an axe had struck it, and the next thing I knew there was no tree with me any more, nor any bow. I tried also to turn in the air so as not to strike on the back of my head, and was beginning to turn, I think, when I hit. Something went through me from behind, and I heard a rip like tearing a bed sheet. Another thing buckled and snapped under me, and I was out of breath on the ground, hurt badly somewhere as the gun went off again, then again, and again. I got to one knee and crouched and crow-hopped toward two and finally behind some rocks on the upper river side of the tree. I stayed low. The gun went off again. Then I slowly lifted my head over the rock. He was staggering toward the tree, trying to get the gun up. I saw the arrow hanging down his back just below the neck. It was painted entirely red and was just hanging by the nock and slipping stiffly and softly. Die, I thought. My God, die, die. I slid down on my right side on the back of the rock and laid my cheek to the stone. I looked down at my other side, and an arrow, the crooked one from the bow quiver, was sticking through it, and the broken bow was still hanging to it by the lower part of the clip. I put my head down and was gone. The hardness of the rock against my breath woke me. I propped up and looked at myself. The arrow had gone through about an inch of flesh in my side, as carefully as I could, but with the pain of every move making my soul shrivel and beg for help. I stripped the feathers off the arrow, and then set my teeth and started to work it through and out. It came slowly at first, and then it didn't. The arrow stuck solidly, and I could not move it at all without coming very close to passing out. I would have to cut. I took the knife from my belt, sliced away the nylon I was wearing from around it, and looked. Then I cut. I took the knife and drove it down with both hands. The knife fell and rang on the stone. The shaft would come. I moved it through me a little more, and the wound changed. The bloody shaft was in my hands, and my side was oozing and pouring down the rock. I went down after it, the arrow still in my hands, and stood up. Could I walk? What else could I do? Walking was odd and one-sided, but not impossible. I walked over to the man lying face down. I turned him over with a foot, and his face came clear. I fell down. The knife fell away. My heart moved into my bad side and beat there, trying to throw my blood away any way it could. I put my hands over my face and went wild with terror. I could not look again. His mouth was open and full of yellow teeth. But was it? I crawled over to him and picked up the knife. I put it in his mouth and pried at the gums, and a partial upper plate began to come out. He was dressed like the toothless man in the clearing. Whether exactly like him, I truthfully couldn't say, but very much like. I stepped to the edge of the bluff. I looked downriver first, for I was afraid to look upriver and see that unchanging emptiness. But even looking downriver, I could tell that the emptiness upstream was not complete, that there was something there like a moat, and I turned to it to be able to face it and make sure. Lewis's canoe shone there, flashing frankly in the sun, riding grayly like a trout coming out of the rapids. I looked at the dead man. "You are dead, Lewis," I said to him. "You and Bobby are dead. You didn't start on time. You did everything wrong. I ought to take this rifle and shoot the hell out of you, Bobby. You incompetent asshole. You soft city country club man. You'd have been dead. You should have been dead. Right about exactly now. You're right in line. You're going slow. You're going slow. You're just sitting there. If I hadn't come up here and did what I did, you'd have been floating along now with no brains and no blood, and so would Lewis." I put my thumb and forefinger in my mouth and whistled as loud as I could, a high, cutting whistle that nearly deafened me. Bobby looked up. He pulled up his paddle and dug slowly in on his right to turn the canoe in to the cliff. I uncoiled the rope from my belt. I didn't believe I had enough to let the body all the way down to the river, but I could let it down some of the way, and after that I was sure I could think of something. I dragged the body to the edge of the cliff and put the rope around it and made it as fast as I could. I tied the other end of the rope to the tree closest to the edge. I shoved the body over the edge with my feet. I looked inland and got down on my knees, took hold of the rope with one hand above and one below the cliff edge, slid my feet over and started down. But my hands and arms were almost strengthless. The only way I knew I was still holding, beside the pain in my hands, was that I didn't fall. When I was almost on top of the corpse, holding on and bracing out from the cliff with a foot and a knee, trying to figure out a way to get around him or clear of him, the rope broke and we were gone. I got a good kick against the cliff, and this moved me out a few feet from the wall. I hit the water at the side of the canoe and pulled up as carefully as I could. My face was no more than 8 inches from Lewis's. His eyes were closed and he looked both resting and dead, but his head turned. His eyes opened. He gave me a long, serious glance, closed his eyes again tiredly, and settled farther down on his back. I worked around the canoe to land and faced Bobby. "Is this what you call first light?" "Listen," he said, "Lewis has been having a bad time. Once I thought he died. He's awful bad hurt." "You would have died yourself. He was waiting for you up there. You didn't do what I told you, and you would have died. He could have shot you 50 times because you did what you did, and because you didn't do what you should have done." We walked over to the shattered body on the rocks with 2 or 3 parts of the denture plate beside the head. He had hit the rocks right on his face. We turned him over. The face was unbelievable. More unbelievable than anything else. I could hear Bobby catch his breath. Then I heard the breath speak. "It looks like you shot him from the front. How?" "I did," I said. "I shot straight into him." "Boy," he said, "something really gored you." "I fell onto the other arrow," I said. "I'm sure glad I don't use 4-bladed heads." I was coming out of me, but not as fast as I might have been. I took on my shorts and stood there bleeding and naked, and took the bloody sleeve I had already cut off and used it to hold the shorts into the wound. Then I put what was left of the suit back on. "Let's finish up and get going," I said. We piled up 5 or 6 mean-looking stones next to the body. I cut the rope into sections and tied the rocks onto the man, with the biggest one around his neck, squeezing the arrow wound together and almost out of sight. "Not here," I said. "Out in the middle of the river, where it's hardest to get to." We struggled with him and with each other, and he and the rocks made it finally into the canoe with Lewis. The canoe moved very badly with all the weight. We left the bank, and for a moment we were just going downstream, too tired to do anything else. The sound of rapids was somewhere in front of us, carrying terror once more amongst so much other terror. Bobby steadied the canoe while I got to my knees and shoved the man over the side. He was gone completely into the river. We were by ourselves, moving. We turned a long corner. The river freshened before us and around us, and I drove in the paddle. On each side the cliffs began to fall away. We went over some little rapids that shook us and picked up our speed a little, but not much. Where would we come out? What was there to see that men had made that would tell us? What would we see when we got off the river forever? Far off, there was what looked like a stretch of rapids with a few big rocks. The sound was low-throated and pleasant rather than frightening, and beyond that another wooded turn. We were moving toward the white, light water, and were very close to it, when I saw Drew's body backed up between the rocks and looking straight at us. We headed for him for hhis place in the rocks, pulling hard against the current that wanted to take us past him. We stopped, we lodged lightly, and I got out onto the sandy soil. Drew was sitting up, facing upstream in a kind of rough natural chair made of two stones where part of the river ran through, split off from the main current by a flat rock. Though he was sitting, it was a very easy, careless, even carefree position, partly on the base of his spine. Water ran up and fell back from the top part of his chest, and a thin, continuous spray of it went into his open mouth, making a quivering, sensitive silver bell around his lips where one gold filling glinted. His eyelids were also kept propped open by the current, seeming to see out of the open water back up into the mountains around all the curves of the river infinitely. The pull of the water on his mouth gave him a cretinous, loose-lipped look, but the eyes had nothing to do with that. They were blue and all-seeing and clear. I stumbled forward to him like meeting him in a drunken bar. I tried to pull him out of his seat by the straps of his life jacket, but for a moment he wouldn't come. Then he rose with no muscles into my arms against the current. I laid him over it on his stomach. I looked at his head. Something had hit him awfully hard there, all right. But whether it was a gunshot wound, I didn't know. I picked Drew up again and dragged him to the canoe. "Lewis," I said quietly. He didn't answer. His eyes were closed and he was breathing hard. "Lewis, give us just a second. It's important. It's very important." He turned his head and opened his eyes. I turned Drew's head and went under his hair to the place I wanted Lewis to see. "Lewis, was he shot? Did a bullet make this?" He nodded, hardly a motion at all, and then sank back. "Grazed," he said. "Are you sure? Are you sure?" He nodded again, and Bobby and I looked at each other. "We're almost out of it now," I said. "What are we to do with Drew?" "We're going to sink him in this river," I said. "Forever." "Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord." A faint light came through Bobby's eyes, then either darkened or died. "There's no end to it," he said. "No end." "Yes, there is," I said. "This is the end. This is all we have to do, but we've got to do it right. Everything depends on it. The whole works." I fumbled around in my lower leg pocket and got out the extra bowstring. I tied it around a good-sized rock and then around Drew's belt, square knot on square knot. We put the rock in the canoe, and I took Drew's body in the kapok jacket and laid it back in the water, wading forward with him past the rapids, hauling and bullying him gently along. When the water deepened, Bobby stepped into the canoe and picked up the paddle. Drew and I moved off the end of the rapids, and I took slow flight in my life preserver. I looked at Drew's hand floating palm up, with the guitar calluses puckered and white, and his college class ring on it, and I wondered if his wife might not like to have the ring. But no, I couldn't even do that. It would mean having to explain. I undid his life belt and let him fall away under me. On his knees beside Lewis in the canoe, Bobby heaved the stone overboard. One of Drew's feet flew up and touched my calf, and we were free and in hell. For a long time, nothing happened but fatigue and heat. Insects danced over the canoe between Bobby and me, a singing haze I was not sure wasn't inside my head. I knew I must have misjudged the distance we had to go, for there seemed to be no end to it. I had put on Drew's life jacket over mine. It was awfully hot that way, but the extra collar came up higher on the back of my neck and kept the sun off it, and I was grateful for that. I could feel my lips swelling with the sun. I was coming slowly up against an absolute limit, but I did not know where it was or where we would be on the river when I got to it, or what I would do when I did. "Bobby," I said suddenly, "hang on." If we can stay with it for 10 miles, we'll be out. I know we will. We've come an awful goddamn long way, and it can't be much longer." He tried to nod and partly did. There was a low, new tone in the river, an old one, something I recognized. "God," I said, "do something for us." We went toward it, but when we came around the next turn, there was nothing but another turn about a half-mile ahead. The sound came from there, or through there. It was more likely that I was listening to a falls, and I got ready to die again. The sound jumped higher all at once. There was a foaming seethe in it, a hoarse desperation. We turned again. The land to the left broke away, and I looked down a set of rapids steeper, a lot steeper, than any we had been through, and longer, all stepped down toward a funnel that disappeared between two huge boulders that turned the air between them white. The current had us. We were going there. I dug in hard, then tried to backwater on the other side, saw it was useless, dug in on the right again as hard as I could to turn the bow, and we swung and jumped, shooting, into the hole. For a second I couldn't see anything at all, and rode like I was standing still with aerated water filling my mouth and little fluttering bumps coming up through the canoe shell. With nothing to see go past, motion died. Something snatched at the paddle, and I pulled it out and dug again and again. The river showed in front in a blinking leap, and we came shooting forward as though launched to take off into the air. We were going faster than I had ever been in anything without an engine. The force of water around the paddle blade was stupendous. I felt as though I had dipped into some supernatural source of primal energy. It was like riding on a river of air. The rocks flickered around and under us, then sand, then rocks, changing colors into each other as we streamed through. I half rose out of my seat. Nothing else could be said to me but this, in this way. It was unkillableness, the triumph of an illusion, when events bear it out. I looked to see what was coming to me next. "Hold on, baby," I hollered. "We're going home." Ahead was a tilted flange of rock with water sculpted over it in a long, curling, four-locked curve that broke at us and then away from us past the rock, and then a low wall of rocks that looked like they shallowed out on both sides. I dug for the rock to go straight over, to have the thing whole. We went up like the beginning of an incline. The nose lifted, a powerful surge caught up with us from the rear. We rolled out over the top of the rock in one unstoppable motion. I closed my eyes and screamed with Lewis, mixing my voice with his bestial scream, blasting my lungs out where we hung 6 feet over the river for an instant and then began to fall. I waited for the upward revengeful smash of the river, but the nose rode down with an odd softness and into the back-scrolled smashed water at the foot of the rock, quivered straight back through the spine of the canoe into mine and into my brain. I listened for my cry hanging in the wet air above the blue and white flag colors of the rock, and I still listened for it. And we were down and slowing forward, back on green water, solid and heavy on it, and it solid and heavy under us. The bedrocks fell away. Another curve, one without rapids, began to open in front of us 100 yards farther on. I looked at Bobby. He turned half around back to me and opened the eye on that side. He started to say something but didn't, and I started to and didn't. Now in calm water, I began to collect everything we needed to make the future with. "Right back there is where it all happened," I said. He looked at me without any understanding at all. "Somebody is going to ask us things. When that happens, tell him that right back there was where Drew fell out. We all fell out. That was where Lewis broke his leg, and we lost the other canoe." "Okay," he said without conviction. "See that big yellow tree?" I said. "That's going to be the main thing. That and the rapids and that big rock we went over. We can put them together, and that'll be all we need to do." Lewis didn't say anything. Either he was out of it or it would have been too much of an effort to answer. "We spilled at the bad place we just came through," I said. "We can even tell them that we spilled going through all that spray between the rocks. We spilled, and Drew was drowned. Since our watches have stopped, we won't be able to say exactly when it was, but we can say where. Where is at that yellow tree." Bobby looked a little less tired. "So give me back the story," I said. He did, and he was accurate. I was pleased. I began to feel safer, for I was dreading going back to men and their questions and systems. I had been dreading it without knowing it. I was heavy-bodied but light-minded, and felt, as I hadn't for the last few hours, that I could go on for a while. More and more I just let us drift, paddling only enough to keep the nose downriver. We went around the same turn. I could not have told you how they differed, 8 or 10 more times. After about another hour, which would have made it from the heat and the height of the sun about noon or early afternoon, we came around another turn like the others, but across the river was a plank bridge set in a steel frame. Just beyond it was a gentle spillway. A man and a boy were fishing with cane poles below it. We muscled the canoe laboriously cross-river to land. When we touched the bank, Bobby got to his feet in the canoe and swayed for a minute, then stepped out into the kudzu. I got into the slime and waded out of the river and never touched it again with my feet or legs. We beached the canoe and took off our life preservers. Lewis lay there beyond us with his hands crossed over him. He was terrifically sunburned. Flakes of skin came off his lips when he moved them. "Lewis," I said from land, "do you hear me?" "I hear you," he said calmly and strongly, but with his eyes closed. "I hear you, and I've been hearing you. You've got it figured? We can get out of this. They won't ask me anything, and if they do, I've got the word, same as you gave Bubby. You're doing it exactly right. You're doing it better than I could do. Hang in there." "Do you feel anything in your leg?" "No, but I haven't moved it or fooled with it or thought about it for a long time. I kept trying to put it to sleep back yonder, and now I can't wake it up. It doesn't matter, though. I'm all right." "I'm going to get somebody," I said. "Can you hold out a little longer?" "Sure," he said. "Lie still. We're home free. Lie still and don't worry." I told Bobby to stay with the canoe and climbed up the kudzu of the bank to the road that ran across the bridge. About a half a mile along it was a country gas station, a store with 2 stark yellow pumps, probably Shell. A country teenager was sitting on the backless bottom of a kitchen chair just inside the screen door, which was shifting and tapping with flies. Though he had probably been watching me come, he could not believe me at close range. He got up and opened the door. "Is there a phone here?" I asked. He looked as though he didn't know whether there was or not. "I've got to get an ambulance out here," I said, "and I've got to get to the highway patrol. People are hurting, and one's dead." When I woke up, I was in a big country room with loud reddish curtains and a huge mirror on the wall opposite me. I lay and thought. The ambulance had arrived and taken us to the local hospital. They patched me up, cleaned out the arrow wound. Lewis was still there. Bobby and I were found rooms in a boarding house. I wanted to see Bobby first, and then Lewis. When I found out from the lady clearing away breakfast where Bobby was, I went up to his room. I sat down in a rocking chair, and he sat on the bed. "First of all," I said, "I need some clothes. You probably ought to have some, too, if we've got enough money. Your clothes are in better shape than mine, so you go out and get them. We're all right so far. Lewis is getting taken care of, and our story is going over." "I'm not so sure," said Bobby. "Did that one guy ask you about the canoes?" "No." "What guy?" "What about the canoes?" "The little old guy who's some sort of local lawman. He asked me about the other canoe. Where was it? When did we lose it? What was in it?" "What did you tell him?" I told him what we agreed to tell him, that we lost it in that last bad place. Did he say anything else? No, I don't have any idea what he was getting at. I do, I said. At least I think I do. And it could be trouble. Maybe not real trouble, but trouble. Why, for the Lord's sake? Because we lost the green canoe the day before yesterday, and it, or part of it, might even have been found before we got to the place where we said we lost it. Jesus. We'll have to try to patch it up then. It's likely that this little guy is going to get the word around to the state police that something doesn't jibe in our story. And then they'll be asking us all kind of questions. Remember your movies. Police like to separate suspects and try to get them to contradict each other. So we've just got to sit here right now and become contradict-proof. We'll say we spilled first a long ways upriver, and that's where we lost the green canoe and Lewis was hurt. But we all survived and tried to make it downriver in Lewis's canoe. We were overloaded and taking chances trying to get Lewis out and just couldn't control the canoe when we hit the bad rapids. That last half mile of falls got us, and Drew didn't make it. Now stay with that. Stay with it. If we do, we'll make it home tomorrow night, or maybe even tonight. I went back to my room and lay thinking again. I was looking forward to the encounter with the local sheriff, or whatever he was. I was looking forward to his local species of entrapment. Bobby came back with the clothes, and I pulled them on. Then we got into Drew's car and drove out to the hospital. There were 2 highway patrol cars there. Here we go, I said. Hold on. We went in, and a fellow in white showed us to the ward where Lewis was. There were 3 highway patrol officers there, talking quietly among themselves with toothpicks in their mouths. And Lewis was lying either asleep or under sedation in a corner of the empty ward with a sheet medically levitated over his legs. I turned to the patrolman. Have you been talking to him, I asked. No, one of them said. We've been waiting for him to come around. He's around, I expect, or he will be soon. Give him a minute. Lewis was looking straight at me. Hello, Tarzan, I said. I got in between Lewis and the nearest patrolman, got in close, almost head to head, and winked. He winked back, though anybody who didn't know it was a wink wouldn't have. Everything went, I said. Drew was killed. You remember me telling you? I think so, he said. I don't remember him in the canoe after that. I don't remember. You remember all that spray? I asked. I remember, sort of, he said. Was that where it was? That's where it was for Drew, I said slowly. You and Steinhauser's tub bought it in the first spill. I couldn't see anything, he said. Looking straight up, I couldn't even see the sky. Lewis had got the message. I was sure he had, and not too soon. After about 15 minutes, the police officer walked ordinarily along to us. Why don't we go on back into town, he said. All right, I told him, whatever you say. We got into the patrol car with him and we started back. I didn't say anything and he didn't either. When we reached town, he went into a cafe and made a couple of calls. In a little while, 2 more patrol cars showed up. One of the police from another car was talking to a local fellow about roads going up the river. A few minutes after this, we all got ready to start out. As we left, another police car, very local looking, drove up and by, and I saw my man, an old fellow, rusty and quiet. There was going to be a meeting somewhere upriver. My beard tingled at the roots, and I started to calculate, yet once again. The road got worse and worse the nearer we got to the river. It figured. At the river's edge, we were crawling. This about where it was? The cop asked me. No, I said, waking from a half-sleep I didn't know I was in. It was further up. We wouldn't have come down here all the way from Ori if we wanted to turn the canoe over in calm water. He looked at me oddly, or I suppose he did, for I was watching straight ahead for the yellow tree and listening one more time for the falls. It was an hour of slow going over gullies and washouts with just enough track for regular cars. The rapids were roaring upstream about a quarter of a mile. I could see some of them now, and they were a lot worse even than I remembered. The policeman pointed. "He'd be right in here?" "I'd say so," I said. "He may be downstream farther, though. Or he may be caught in the rocks, but we probably ought to start here." Other cars were creeping up to us, and pretty soon they filled up the bank all the way out of sight downriver. Some men brought long ropes with hooks, grapples on them, and I understood the full horror of the phrase I was always seeing in the newspapers, especially in the summer: drag the river for the body. Drag was right. I sat under a bush, watching the men and waiters. Someone was coming, casually but deliberately. "Say, buddy," the man said, "can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure," I said. "Sit down." He did. We shook hands. "You say you started out day before yesterday?" "We started Friday at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon." "In 2 canoes?" "Right." "And you lost one of them right here?" "No. A long ways upstream, when we came through here, we were all in one canoe." This was the silence now. It went on for at least a minute. "Your buddy says different." "I'll be damned if he does," I said. "Go ask him." "I already done asked him." "Ask him again. Or the one in the hospital." No. You done had a chance to talk to him." "Your hearing must not be any too good." "It's good enough. We ain't gonna find nobody right in here. We're gonna find it further on up." "What the hell are you driving at?" I said, and the indignation was real. He was assaulting my story, which had cost me so much time and energy, and, yes, blood. "We've been through a goddamn bad time, and I'm damned if I want to put up with this kind of shit. Listen, are you the sheriff here?" "Deputy." "Is the sheriff around here?" "He's right over yonder." "Well, go get him. I want to talk to him." He got up and went over to a beefy, Texasy farmer with a badge, and they came back together. I shook hands with the sheriff, whose name was Bullard. "Sheriff, I don't know what this man has in mind because he won't tell me. But from what I can gather, he thinks we threw one of our party in the river or something." "Maybe you did," the old man said. "For Christ's sake, for what reason?" "How would I know that? I know you can't get your story straight, and there ain't no good reason for you to be lying." "Easy, Mr. Queen," the sheriff said. Then to me, "What about this?" "What do you mean, what about it? This man has got some kind of personal stake in this. He doesn't like city people. He's trying to create interest in himself. God knows what. What's the matter, Mr. Queen? People feel like you're not earning your money?" "I'll tell you what's the matter, you city son of a bitch," Queen said in that country murderous tone that always bled me white. "My sister called me yesterday and told me her husband had been out hunting and hadn't come back. There ain't nobody off in them woods up yonder. I'll just goddamn well guarantee you, y'all met up with him somewhere, and I'm gonna prove it." "Fine, prove it." "What's wrong with you, Mr. Queen?" the sheriff asked. "Why jump on these fellas about something in your family? Just 'cause they're from the city? Maybe your brother-in-law fell down and got hurt." "Nah, he wouldn't." "Why are you so damn sure that anything happened to him?" I said. "I just got a feeling," Queen said, "and I ain't never been wrong about that." "Well, you're wrong this time," I said. "Now stop bothering me. Go and do whatever you got a mind to do, but get off my back. I've had it with this river, with the woods, with the whole fucking business up here, and most especially with you. Unless you've got something to accuse us of, and have got some evidence to support what you're saying, whatever it is, you can goddamn well let me alone." He backed off, muttering. Queen didn't have a thing on us, and he wouldn't get anything. The next day we went out to see Lewis, who was much better. His leg was raised in pulleys, and he was reading the county paper, which had a story about Drew's disappearance, and an account of dragging the river for him, with a picture in which I could recognize myself and Deputy Queen. He had his fist up at my face, and I knew that the picture had been taken during the last part of the time we had been talking. I looked like I was being tolerant, just barely listening out of courtesy. Everything helped. This, too. Bobby and I walked over to say goodbye to Lewis. He was eased back in the pillows. "I ought to be out of here in a week or two myself," he said. "Sure," I said. "Lie back and enjoy yourself. This ain't such a bad town." Bobby and I drove back to Biddeford's to wait for the sheriff. He came at 5:30, and evil little Queen was with him. The sheriff took out a piece of paper. "You can use this for a statement," he said. "See if it says what you told us." I read it through. "It's all right," I said. "You sure now?" Sheriff Bullard asked. "He ain't sure," Deputy Queen said, a lot louder than any of us. "He's lying. He's lying through his teeth. He's done something up yonder. He done killed my brother-in-law." "Listen, you little bastard," I said when my voice was really quivering. "Maybe your brother-in-law killed somebody. Why are you bringing in all this talk of killing? The river did all the killing we saw. If you don't think it'll kill you, get your stupid ass on it and see for yourself." "Now, Mr. Gentry," the sheriff said, "don't talk like that. Ain't no call for it." "Well, this'll do till there is," I said. "He's lying, Sheriff. Don't let him go. Don't let the son of a bitch go." "We got nothing to hold him for, Arthur," the sheriff said. "Nothing. These boys have been through a lot. They want to get back home." "Don't let him go, I'm telling you. Listen, my sister called up last night and she was just a-crying. Benson ain't come home yet. She knows he's dead. She just knows it. He ain't never been gone this long before, and these fellas was the only ones up in there when he was." "Now, you don't know that, Arthur," the sheriff said. "What you mean is they was the only city fellas." I shook my head as though I couldn't believe such stupidity, which was the case, sure enough. "You all can go any time you want to," the sheriff said. "Just leave me your addresses." I did and said, "Okay, let us know if you find anything." "Don't worry, you'll be the first." We started to get in Drew's car. "Before you go, buddy, let me ask you something and tell you something." "Ask me." "How come you all ended up with 4 life jackets?" "We had an extra one. In fact, we had 2. You're liable to find another one down the river. They float, you know." "Now, what was it you wanted to tell me?" "You done good." "Somebody had to do something," I said. "I didn't want to die either." "You was hurt bad, but if it wasn't for you, you'd all be in the river with your other man." "Thanks, Sheriff. I take that with me." And so it ended, except in my mind, which changed the events more deeply into what they were, into what they meant to me alone. For a long time I went through both daily papers from column to column every day, but only once did the word Kahulawasi come off the page at me, and that was when the dam at Aintree was completed. Every night as the water rose higher, I slept better, feeling the green, darkening water crawl up the cliff, up the sides of rock, feeling for the handholds I had had, dragging itself up, until finally I slept as deeply as Drew was sleeping. The river and everything I remembered about it has become a possession to me, a personal, private possession, as nothing else in my life ever had. Now it runs nowhere but in my head, but there it runs as though immortally. I could feel it, I can feel it, on different places on my body. It pleases me in some curious way that the river does not exist, and that I have it. In me it still is, and will be until I die. Green, rocky, deep, fast, slow, and beautiful beyond reality. I had a friend there who in a way had died for me, and my enemy was there.